Okay, so welcome everyone, or welcome back. This is the very first session of 2022 for the Mixed Methods and Mixed Data Research seminar. Just a couple of words about the series in case this is the first time you join us. So this is a series that is a kind of a spin-off from the causality series that we held last year, but with a more focus on the methods. So this is a way of zooming in. But when we look at methods, we also have a broad focus on plurality of methods. And this is for us a way of zooming out in a sense. It is set up by myself. I'm Federica Russo, philosopher of science and technology based at the University of Amsterdam. And I co-organize it with Sofia Pagliarin, who is also one of our panelists today, and Lasse Heditz. Both of them, they are on the screen this afternoon. So the format, as you may know by now, is that we have a couple of panelists for each session on a given topic. And panelists give a short pitch, say 7 minutes, hopefully less, hopefully not too longer than these 7 minutes. And then we have general discussion. The goal is really to exchange ideas, explore problems, look for solutions ahead in case you practice mixed methods or any other empirically oriented research. We look at conceptual and empirical problems. We look at research, but we also have an interest in teaching. The first session was about well, we started off with the broad problem of the qualitative-quantitative divide. And we started with the problem of exploring the quantitative side and what does it mean to give it some kind of qualitative significance. And this time we do exactly the opposite. Basically, we discuss again the nature of data, but we focus on quantifying qualitative data. We know that quantification may be a necessary step, but we also know that it has a number of challenges, and the challenges are probably kind of common to many sciences. But the fact that multi-method series by default use both types of data makes this an even more urgent problem to address. So, without taking all the space, because we have more expert and knowledgeable people on the topic today, what I would like to do, first I present the two panelists, and then I give the floor to each of them in turn. So Sofia Pagliarin, you can wave so that everyone understands who you are on the screen. Recently started working as a postdoc in a project on smart cities and social inclusiveness at the Vital Cities and Citizens initiatives at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And in her previous research, she has examined association between multi-level governance processes and land use change. And she has been using both qualitative and quantitative data. So this really makes her an expert on the topic. She's passionate about methods for comparative research, and in particular, qualitative comparative analysis. And together with Lasse, she has proposed a variant of this qualitative comparative analysis, or QCA for short, so that you can better integrate time into the methods procedures. And she's also one of the co-organizers of the QCA expert and paper development workshop annually held in Zurich, and for the time being online, well, pandemics oblige. Now, second panelist today is Roel Rutten, who is an expert also in qualitative comparative analysis, and he plays an active role in developing the method and has given several QCA workshops. So again, you can see why we choose these people. And his research interests focus on geography of knowledge creation and organization of knowledge creation. And he does that partly at Tilburg University, where he is a senior researcher, and he's also visiting professor at Newcastle Business School, Northumbria University, and he's a senior consultant at the European Regional Affairs Agency. And as a consultant, he specializes in regional innovation policy. So plenty of expertise for us, and I'm sure they will have very good ideas for us to think about. So I suggest Sofia goes first, and immediately after Roel, and after the two panelists, we will open the floor for general discussion. I kindly ask you to mute yourself if you're not already muted, and if you want to ask a question or make a comment, either use the chat or raise your virtual hand, and I will keep track of the speakers. Without much further ado, Sofia, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Federica. I will, as one of the co-organizers of the event, as you said, as we suggest panelists to try not to use the slides, I will have to do it, and I will have to try today. So I have prepared something to show analogically, and let's see how it works. I have structured my talk, so this brief talk. I hope to be to be able to stay within the 7 minutes allocated. I have structured my talk along 3 main themes, so which are doing research as a type of social process, what I consider, and then what I consider the 3 main ways to quantify qualitative data in the social sciences. And then also what I consider a good way to meaningfully quantify qualitative data. So I will start with the first theme, which is conceptualizing research as a type of social process. And I think that this theme is relevant for today's discussion because in the social sciences, we construct our data. And actually, I found this quite old book, quite useful. It has almost 40 years, and the author is Nicholas Bateson, and the title is Data Construction in Social Surveys. So in this book, Bateson analyzes research as a social process, and he says that it is a way to generate new knowledge about the social world. And Bateson points out that there are different actors in the social process. So we have the commissioner or the third-party funders. Then we have the researchers and the different roles that the researchers can perform, and also the respondents or the people we ask to, either through questionnaire or interviews, to get this knowledge, to get this information to then generate new knowledge. And so I think that this is quite key when thinking about quantification of qualitative data, because also in quantitative research, as we can see in this book, there is a process of interpretation going on across these 3 main actors, and the researcher sort of like acts as a node across these different types of knowledge. In a way, metaphorically, the researcher is a sort of a bridge, or performs the role of a bridge between 2 coasts, like the East and the West in the Bosphorus. And this is so these coasts that the researcher bridges knowledge between are the goal of the research, so what we want to know, and then the information we get from the respondents, so where the data are. And of course, I mean, I take a critical realist perspective here, and this means that there is a difference between our data and the structure of the social world out there. And this is especially true in the social sciences, where data exist because we construct them. So in this sense, I believe that the quantitative and qualitative research in the social sciences work in the same way, because precisely because research is a type of social process. But what is different, however, between the qualitative and quantitative approaches is our measurement tools, so our metrics, or how we then construct this data. And here I go to my second theme for my talk, which is what I think are the 3 main ways we have to quantify data in the social sciences are. And this is, sorry, the 3 main ways. So this is the triangle. So first, we consider the qualitative material in verbal or textual form as a data to be counted, for instance, as in text data analysis, where we analyze our verbal data or textual data as a corpus that should be counted, for which frequencies should be provided. We can set word clouds and also identify links between these words as objects. And I think that it is maybe the most quantified way to treat qualitative data, because we consider words as objects, or it is more objectified. Which is also, I think, quite interesting for mixed method analysis or mixed method research, because if we have text data analysis on one side that counts data on a corpus of verbal data, then we should also ask ourselves where these data come from and how they are produced. So maybe a more qualitative way to look at the corpus and to combine both approaches. Then I think that the second way we have to quantify qualitative data is through code books. So we do it when analyzing interviews or when analyzing documents. We are using codes, so the bricks of our analysis that are either theory-driven or more related to the empirical data that we have collected. And they can come in the form of tables or lists, and it is a way to go a level up of abstraction from our qualitative data. And then we can also count and set links between these codes as segments. So we have both the empirical data that comes in a verbal form, and also our codes in themselves can be the object of our analysis. And then the third way, I think we have to translate between these main ways to translate qualitative data into numbers. I think that the third way is calibration, and I think that Roel will talk more about this later on. But calibration is a key step in qualitative comparative analysis, where basically the researcher assigns set membership values to types of cases. And what I really like of calibration is that it explicitly asks the researcher to step out and be clear about her code book, basically, or these calibration rules that a researcher uses to assign the set membership values to different type of cases. And I think this is also going back again or highlighting even more how data are constructed in the social sciences. And this brings me also, this brings me to the last point of my talk, which is how do we meaningfully quantify qualitative data in the social sciences, provided that we have these three main types of data. And I make here explicit reference to another researcher, Salvatore Lamendola, because I think that a good way to meaningfully quantify qualitative data is to take care of the relational and communication aspects of the research. So it's about the relation that we set. And I think that first researchers should take care more of their relationship with their own research. So again, to take responsibility to be these translators between types of knowledges, as I said at the beginning. So to be key actors in the data generation and interpretation of data. And this also, and second, I also think that the researchers should take more responsibility about how they retrieve information. So to pay much more attention about the relationship that they establish with the interviewees, because they are not information boxes or data jukeboxes. They are not, they are people. And I think that a way to reflect this new care for the relational and communication aspects of the research is to change or adjust our jargon. So to avoid using the words like respondents or informants, and maybe use participants or narrators, or replace data collection with data construction or data generation. So these are my first main themes for today. For today's discussion, I will stop here to give the word to Roel.
Thank you so much, Sofia. This was very, very rich. I'm now looking for Roel on my screen so that I can pin him. And Roel, you can start whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much. And I'll basically pick up where Sofia left, because I think our talks connect very well. And I'll share your example of not using slides, because I don't really need them. I can just talk straight away. First of all, I think we need to ask ourselves what quantification actually is. And I think there's two aspects to quantification. The first thing is about interpretation, and that's really about sticking a number on meaning, about making categories and just numerate them. And I think this can make investigation comparison more methodic, more systematic. A second aspect of quantification is converting data, qualitative data, into linear scales so that we can use it in metrics. Well, that goes a step further than just sticking a number on meaning. And I don't think you need to make the second step. You know, it's okay for many purposes just to go, just the first step, to stick a number on meaning. Now, calibration, Sofia referred to that, which is important in QCA. To me, fundamentally, is about interpretation. It's about making an interpretation of what is the nature of your cases, and then qualifying that, and you can stick a value on that and set membership value on it. But calibration is more about the meaning than about the value. Not every QCA methodologist will agree on this. I mean, there are plenty of methodologists in QCA who think of QCA as a very empirical method, but that's a debate we're having with those people. Let me give you an example of what I mean. The whole world nowadays is divided into color codes, COVID color codes. Every region, every country has a color code. Now, actually, these color codes are an example of qualifying quantitative data, because the underlying data, infection rates, is very quantitative. But what you do with each code, green, amber, red, dark red, is you cluster regions into categories that have a similar COVID situation. And it's these categories, these colors, that are meaningful. There's lots of irrelevant variation between those countries, between those regions. All the red regions have different degrees of COVID severity, but it's a difference in kind. They are similar in kind. And of course, you can stick a number on these codes, then you quantify the qualitative data again. With the green can be the 1 and the dark red can be the 4 or the 5, depending on how many categories you have. But that would clearly be an ordinal scale, not a linear scale, and you'd have to be cautious to use that in metrics. So quantification as interpretation is really about condensing qualitative data into meaningful categories and sticking a number on these categories, which can facilitate investigation, make it more systematic. But it loses nothing of the underlying richness of the data, because you can always go back to that. Quantification is counting, then you add the assumption of linearity of your scales. And I think that makes sense if you decompose your cases into databases and correlate databases like you do in regression analysis. But when you do a case-based analysis, maybe that's not the way you want to go. But then again, it also matters whether you're an empiricist or an interpretivist. Another example, when you grade papers, essays, exams of students, that's clearly qualitative data, and you need to value that. And in the Dutch education system, we use a scale of 1 to 10, but obviously there's also lots of variation. I mean, there's multiple ways in which you can get an 8. Not all 8s, people who score an 8, have the same answer. So these categories, they hide lots of irrelevant variation. So maybe it's more meaningful, instead of to talk about 1 through 10, to talk about excellent, very good, good, that sort of thing. And however detailed you make these categories, there's still lots of irrelevant variation within each category. And it depends on the purpose of your research. How many categories do you need? I mean, it's perfectly all right to have just pass and fail and enumerate that 1 and 0 if that's what interests you. or to have completely different categories. I mean, the 4, 5, and 6, just above and below the sufficient, you can cluster them in one category and call it mediocre and numerate it as 3, and the 9 and the 10 can be the excellent and call that a 1. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It just depends on what you want to know. Now, finally, we had a number of questions about these for this work group. How do you translate qualitative concepts into numbers? How do you ensure that the numbers are meaningful? How do you deal with vagueness and ambiguity of the qualitative data? I think these 3 are very similar questions, and it's about defining meaningful categories and giving each category a number. And it's about how much qualitative diversity can you have in a category. And the 4th question is, how do you decide which metrics is most appropriate? I think that mostly depends on the assumptions you're willing or not willing to make about the nature of your data. Is it meaningful to assume that there's a linear scale? Yes or no? Do you believe in empirical accuracy, or do you believe in ontological accuracy? Are you an empiricist or are you an interpretivist? These are questions I think you need to answer for yourself. And I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong here. And with that, I will close and hand it back to Federica.
Thank you so much, Roel, and thank you for both of you for keeping it within the time. So now we have ample time for the general discussion. So if you have comments or questions, please raise your virtual hands or write your question in the chat, and I will keep an eye both on my screen and on the chat. And maybe while I wait for people to formulate their ideas, I will use my privilege as moderator of this session to put forward a couple of reactions. So one thing that I really enjoyed from Sofia's presentation is the focus on the researcher. And this really strikes me for the kind of training I received in philosophy of science a couple of decades ago, where especially in mainstream philosophy of science, you never want to talk about the researcher because this is not what makes a science objective, right? You really want to talk about the world out there, and then the experiments will tell you the truth about the world, end of the story. And I really like the fact that Sofia is putting the researcher at the very center of this process of attaching meaning to the data and to act as an interpreter in this process. And for me, this resonates with the things that I heard from Roel, especially this idea of having a goal in choosing one way of categorizing or another. And so for me, this was kind of the way in which I was kind of putting the two together in a coherent whole. But that was just one idea I had while listening to them. And I don't want to take too much space. And so please, anyone who wants. Okay, great. So Lasse, please, and then Judith.
Yeah, the unmute button. Yeah, thanks all for the presentations, and many thanks also for the reflections, Federica. I would have I've tons of questions, so let's just start with the first one, and maybe the other ones come later. In moving from qualitative to quantitative data, you inevitably have to lose some richness for coming to sort of more generalized statements, not general statements, but more generalizable statements. So in your views, Sofia and Roel, how do you determine the threshold where you lose too much of that richness of the data? How do you know?
Yeah, thanks, Lasse, for this question. My easy but difficult answer to that is that considering that the relationship with the participant has also to be meaningful in a certain way, I would say that you have a good translation of qualitative data into quantitative measure if the meaning, the interpretation, or if the interpretation of the meaning of what the participants wanted to say is somehow reflected or maintained in the score or the value that you give. And also, actually, Bateson in his book on questionnaire and social service talks about that. He also asks himself and discusses how do we know that that the respondents actually understand and actually rate clearly or have a good understanding of the Likert scale or the questions that we pose them as a researcher. So there is also in quantitative research the same problem. To what extent the data that you collect are meaningful or correct. And there is, I said, I think that the answer is the interpretation that you do with the data that you gather, so that you go back to the relation. But as I said before, the difference with quantitative research is that this question of meaning or how well the metrics or the set membership value or the scale that you use reflects your data is more easily seen in qualitative research just because you ask yourself this question. And I think that quantitative researchers, because they are more detached maybe from the data or the data construction and collection process, they do not make so often these, do not pose themselves this question so often. So I guess it's really one of the, your question is one of the key question of data construction in the social sciences in general.
Thank you, Sofia. Roel, would you like to add anything to that?
I'll briefly follow up on that. In addition, I think in the social science, all measurement is theory and value laden. So also the thresholds you set are theory and value laden. So you need to be very explicit about the criteria you use. And to give a short example, I mean, every human being has a degree of narcissism, but we would only recognize a narcissist above a certain threshold of narcissism. Where is that threshold? I think, on the both ends, not a narcissist and a narcissist is quite obvious, but once you get closer to the threshold, it becomes more difficult to distinguish a person, identify a person as either a narcissist or not a narcissist. So maybe in an analysis, those ambiguous cases, you shouldn't use them. You should not use them in your analysis because they don't have that much analytical value if you cannot really assign them to one side or another. I think that's one way of dealing with this ambiguity.
Yep. Thanks a lot. Do you want to follow up quickly, Lasse, and then we move on to the next questions?
Right. I take way up too much space, but still, because Roel has made this point out twice, and it does leave out some gray skills, right? That's the price you're willing to pay.
Yeah, I mean, it's about analytical versus empirical clarity. Do you believe that all variation is empirical variation is analytically relevant? Or do you believe there's categories and there's gray areas that you might leave out for analytical clarity? That's what I mean with the difference between, are you an empiricist or an interpretivist? I'm clearly an interpretivist in that sense.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers. Thanks.
Okay, so I see questions multiplying. Judith, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And what I also really liked in Sofia's presentation is this idea of being a translator as a researcher, and I think what's important to realize is that what we are doing when we are quantitizing is not quantitizing qualitative data, but instead we are coding qualitative data, and then we have, for example, the possibility to count the codes. But what we are counting then is the code and not the data, and that has, I think, implications for how we view the translation process, because it not only means that it's very important that the data are such that we are allowed to count the codes, or that we have an interest, given our research question, in counting the codes, which also often is not the case. but also it means that our qualitative analysis has to meet specific criteria in order to determine whether we code it in a way that makes sense, whether the codes are good. And I think that this, looking at the process in these two steps, first the qualitative step and then the quantitative step with their own requirements, makes sense. And not only, I mean, in the mixed method community, we always talk about combining qualitative and quantitative data, but also if you look at, for example, discourse analysis, then it's important that we do not, and the more quantitative types, that we do not forget that this first step, and that's always the interpretation, and that we need good codes. So I don't know whether that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Sofia and Roel, would you like to quickly follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a bit that that's why I identify these three main ways to quantify qualitative data, because I think that what you are referring is the code, so what I referred before as code book. But in my point of view, I think that, for instance, text data analysis really uses the words as objects to count. So it is a step below in a way, although I use also the triangle because they are not ranked. These three main ways are not ranked like one is better than the other. They are just different ways, and then could be also combined because the triangle is one single form. So yeah, just my reaction on that maybe Judith, you were referring on this code book part, and not the other two.
I agree.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, Roel?
Just briefly, I think whatever you code and whatever you quantify, it's always important to think about what kind of scale do you have? Is it just an ordinal scale, or is it a linear scale? And that really influences what you can actually do with the data in terms of metrical analysis. Yeah,
thanks. As we speak, you really make me think that this problem of quantifying, codifying, attaching numbers to qualitative data is not just for the social sciences, and we rarely speak about how the natural sciences or the life sciences kind of address this problem, but we leave this for later. I just wanted to give you an intermezzo as we give the word now to Irina, please.
Thanks, Federica, and thanks, Sofia and Roel, for your interesting thoughts. I do actually have a question for each of you, and that is a different question to each of you. I hope that's okay. Sofia, maybe that sounds a bit provocative, which is not supposed to be, but you were suggesting to operate with different labels. So not to call it data collection, but data generation. Now, I'm studying strategic communication, and I might have some thoughts in mind of why you would do that, some kind of legitimacy for your own field of study and so on. But in terms of knowledge generation, what does that really help us if we kind of label it differently, but we basically mean the same thing? And to Roel, you were mentioning that in terms of we kind of give numbers to meaning, and that should represent kind of the object of study in the best way possible. But I have also the big concern that also these scales, which we kind of think of being more objective in some way than the subjective meanings, they also have to be understood by everyone. And I have made the experience that these scales are usually or oftentimes just not understood by everyone the same way. Just a quick example, I was working in Switzerland before, where we also have a grading scale from 1 to 10. And we used to give also the grade of 10, for instance. And I came here and I did the same thing until colleagues told me that we'd never give the grade of 10 and 9.5. It's the very same scale. So I would be just curious to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Maybe in the order, Sofia, would you like to react?
Yes, yes. Thanks, Irina, for your question. I have to say that I connect this to the last comment by Federica that well, terminology is important because in the life sciences they might also quantify qualitative data. But you know, and maybe there it's easier to use data collection, but because of the key role of the researchers as an agent in the research, as I said before, I think this is a term that hides a lot of, many aspects of the research as a type of social process. In the social sciences, we construct our data, and they are not out there, but they are not like berries that we pick. So we collect the berries or the insects, I don't know, but we have to construct them by asking people, and this asking people produces a gap that, in my point of view, would be better to term or refer to with data construction or data generation, and not simply data collection. So that's my short answer.
Yeah, thanks, Sofia. I may want to come back to this point maybe later, but I see that Roel has to answer the question, and then we have still two people in the line. Roel, please.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Irina that these scales are open to interpretation. In critical realism, you call that epistemic relativism, because all these things are still theory and value laden. And that's why what QCA does, the calibration, is so critically important to explain what you mean, so that it's understandable for readers, for other scientists to understand what you do. Yeah, therefore, I'm in favor of not having too many categories, because more categories can lead to more confusion. And then is it about accuracy, or is it about spurious specificity? So yeah, for me, I agree with what you say, and therefore it's important to really spend time on explaining what your categories are and how you've enumerated that, keeping in mind that different people may have different views on that.
Irina, would you like to react quickly, or do you think you are satisfied with the answer?
I think I'm satisfied, and time is running, so thank you both.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, Gerben, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the inspiring talks and the even more inspiring or critically inspiring reactions, both of you. I fully agree with both of your talks. And then afterwards, I thought, but actually, they're kind of disagreeing also, both of you. So I would like to stress the tension is, on the one hand, the researcher as an involved agent, with Sofia's talk, as someone constructing data, and on the other hand, with Roel, the clear procedures, not too many categories in order to, or factors, or whatever we call them, or elements to look at in order to judge. And there's some kind of tension in it that we also see in marking. And just to say, Roel, I fully disagree with the narcissism example, because the middle group is very interesting. Ask your students if they have a 5.5 or a 5.0. It's quite a difference, and we can't simply say, okay, let's throw it out and forget about that data. But I feel the tension here between both of your talk in marking thesis. So on the one hand, people say, yes, I've read so many theses. I've been doing this for 30 years. I have this experience. I know what a good 7 or a 7.5 is. And I know from my field what I'm talking about. Whereas others say, no, we need rubrics, and we need more and more specified rubrics. And I felt the same kind of tension here. And I'm happy to be convinced that this tension is not there, because I agreed with both of you.
Who would like to resolve the tension first? Maybe Roel, since you muted yourself.
Yeah, well, let me first say that I'm not in favor of throwing out the 5.5 category as such. I'm just saying it's not analytically meaningful, because it's a bit of a vague category. So yes, these cases do exist, but maybe you shouldn't use them in your analysis. As to resolving the tension, I don't really see that much of a tension between defining categories and researchers as involved agents. Because the categories are made, developed, defined, designed by the researcher. and the researcher has to make explicit how and why they are relevant for the object you're studying, for the kind of analysis you're making. And then you also come back to Irina's earlier point. Yeah, this is open to interpretation. So yeah, I come back to a point I earlier made. All measurement is to some degree theory and value laden, and it's your role as a researcher to clearly explain what you're doing and why your categories are relevant and meaningful. Which in a way brings us to the point of Sofia about the role of the researcher, right? Yeah, go ahead, Sofia.
I would like to go back a bit to Lasse's first question. So, you know, that he pointed out in his question that we lose some richness in the data when we quantify them. And yes, there is a tension, or better, it's a trade-off. And how to, there is no way to, how to best quantify qualitative data, in my point of view, or yet we have to find it out. Or maybe it's a process that we have to find out together. And this is also, in a way, the beauty or maybe the ambition that calibration had in the original presentation by Charles Regin in QCA, that it should lead to agreed upon threshold within the social sciences community or within the specific research areas, so that way we all agree that that scale is best represents a phenomenon, but it is nevertheless a representation. So I agree also that the tension is resolved by saying that data are constructed, or recognizing that data are constructed, that they are a representation by the researcher, and ideally by a group of researchers, or even more ideally by the academic community that agrees that a certain scale is more appropriate.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe Benjamin.
Yeah, so I wanted to broaden the conversation a little bit. And go back to also what Judith said. So I think there's different reasons for trying to quantify qualitative data, and there's different types of qualitative data. So I think, first of all, if we go back to an era where, let's say, old school anthropology used qualitative data, you sort of built a story. And in writing the story, you also leave out a lot of data. Okay, but it's not completely clear how the anthropologist goes from the data to the writing. So, for instance, what I find in sort of this, and it still exists a lot, this sort of traditional qualitative analysis and writing, I often ask when somebody presents, I always ask, what were the exceptions? Because they're not always discussed. I mean, you have a neat story, but actually what was against this story? Because that's something you can actually do with qualitative data, but it often gets lost once we start writing. So I think one way in which quantifying, if we use that term, it is a way to become systematic, to show what there is. And for instance, if somebody has a quote, you can actually say, well, this is not one person saying it, but maybe it's this amount of people saying it. So that's one way of doing it. And that's one, and I'm always in favor of that. A second way is to, and this was also mentioned, to do other things with qualitative data, to calculate, to sort of make, for instance, such as in QCA, to say things about relationships between what could be seen as variables, even though I don't think Ragan originally used that term. That then goes to my question. My question is, there's such a difference in how you've done research. So for instance, in my own studies, I used to do case studies, sort of in the tradition that Ragan in What is a Case also describes. I tried to understand what has happened. The research I did involved informants, not respondents. The interviews, if they were such, or observations, were all different. I would talk to people maybe 10 times, 11 times over the course of a year, and you gradually learn more. And you gradually build a story of what happened. You can then maybe compare multiple case studies, but within the case study, the sort of data, if you want to call it that, it's not quantifiable in the sense I think that you're now talking about, because the data itself is sort of talking about a reality from multiple perspectives that you triangulate. Still, I think you should be very systematic about that, and you need ways in which to code it. but maybe the coding has a different way. Then later I did studies on a similar topic, but I interviewed 100 lawyers about their own tax evasion. And all the interviews were qualitative, 1 or 2 or 3 hours long, but they were all designed in the same way. I acted as much as possible in the same way in constructing the data. And then I could then code it and then quantify. But I do think, I mean, as 2 examples, these are very different things. If you're doing so human subject-based qualitative research, whether you have, let's say, respondents and you're sort of comparing at the level of the individual, or you're constructing a case, and then maybe you're later comparing cases. Of course, for that QCA is excellent. But I do think internally, within these cases, the idea of quantifying is a bit different. And so I would like to ask the speakers and maybe also others here, whether we can actually generally talk about this and whether this really doesn't fully depend on your research question, on the level of analysis that you have, and also the approach you have to your research. Because it seems what both of you have in mind is one sort of qualitative analysis and data, and I don't think it fully covers the different kinds that different people work with.
Okay, thanks. Maybe Sofia, Roel, how would you like to respond, or any other people who have ideas on this? Can we generalize, or are we really discussing with one type of qualitative data in mind?
I am actually, I will reply just to clarify, because I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly. So it is on one side the single case study, maybe, or the multiple case study that maybe we can for which we can maybe use qualitative comparative analysis, and then on the other hand the interviews of different people to know more about the persons individually, if I understood right, and the type of treatment that we have with this different type of data. I think that if I understood right, but
if I make it very simple,
yes.
So data within a case study. So yes, it could be a singular case study, how you analyze that. So before you do comparative across cases, you first analyze within the case. I think that's a very different way of working, where you don't have the same type of interviews compared to, for instance, a data set that consists of interviews that were all organized in the same way with a similar sample of people that then is comparable because these interviews were done in a similar way.
Okay, I think I mentioned again, I think the question by Lasse, so that the data are, qualitative data are rich and very heterogeneous. So this is, I think, the nature of qualitative data. And of course, in the quantification, you have to deal with that in different ways. So I guess that it's more difficult to find a formalization that is valid for quantifying qualitative data, that is valid for all types of quantitative data. And again, I go back to the triangle. Maybe it's an hexagon, I don't know, but also to reflect the different ways that there are to quantify and approach qualitative data in a meaningful way. So I also agree with Roel, what Roel said at the beginning, that it really depends about your research goals, and so not only about the type of qualitative data that you have, but also of your own research goals. And this makes a lot of difference. But I don't think there is one single way to treat these different types of qualitative data in the same way, I think.
Okay, Benjamin, are you satisfied for now? Can we move on? We have 2 more people who would like to ask questions. Luke, please.
Yeah, thanks. I'm quite inspired by both talks and the smart remarks made by everyone as well. I was a bit intrigued by the observation that the richness of data is lost when you quantify qualitative data. But how are your thoughts on the same thing, but then the other way around? So for instance, deploying a survey to then enrich that survey with interviews based on the survey responses. Just curious to see if both of the speakers have any smart remarks for that way of working?
Well, in a way, it's a question that's very similar to Benjamin's question. You know, when you follow up survey data with interview data, it gives you within case data, where the survey data usually used on a cross case level. I think most methodologists would agree both are relevant and necessary to ultimately develop conclusions. I would, you know, cutting a few corners here, but I would say within case evidence answers how questions, and cross case data answer why questions. And which one is more important to you? I think that depends on the kind of research questions that you have and the topic that you study, and it depends also a bit on your instincts. But yeah, if it is possible to cluster all sorts of qualitative data into patterns on a cross case level. I don't think it really matters what kind of data you've got, but if you want to really get into the cases to answer the how questions, well, then quantification may not be very helpful because you need the detail.
Yeah, makes sense, Luca. Okay, so are there any other questions or comments? I think I saw Judith raising the hand, but then not anymore. We have only a few minutes left, so maybe let me use a few moments to put forward another type of reflection, maybe something that is following up from what is going on in here, because apart from John, I know he has a background in physics. I don't know whether other people have a background or they are actually active in the natural sciences or in the hard science or in the exact sciences. And that would be very interesting to hear their voices, because it is my experience that it is especially social scientists and humanities philosophers who reflect on the nature of data and on this step from the qualitative to the quantitative side. And all the ideas that we had today show how problematic this process is, how difficult it is. And then we cannot just stop thinking, okay, now we have a matrix, now we have a scale, job done, we have kind of procedures to do that. And it is a reflection that we have to do continuously on a more theoretical level and also as we do research. And I usually don't find that level of reflection in other fields in the natural sciences or even within the philosophy of the natural sciences, where the idea is that you collect the data is out there, and then you collect it and then you work on them. And so the question of Irina, does it make a difference whether you talk about data collection or data generation, is not even discussed at that level, because they don't see the difference. But you know, if you work at the Large Hadron Collider and you put in motion and you start firing stuff, etc., and this particle starts colliding, you are generating data in a way that I don't see significantly different from going to people, interviewing them and generating interviews, seeing text, because you are using machines, and with these machines, and then you have the numbers, and then you read out the numbers, and then, you know, what I'm finding increasingly striking is that these questions come up because we tend to think that the social sciences are not so exact because there is the human component, as if there was no human component in other scientific fields. But I really thank you for all of your incredibly deep remarks that really make the research rich. And I don't know whether there are at this point any further comments or remarks. Yeah, John, I see your
we have to ask
hand.
John. Now we have to hold him responsible.
You triggered me. No,
that was the purpose.
Now, what I indeed was hesitating to say was after the last question asked by Luc, and all the questions about the losing the richness of qualitative data by quantifying them, saying, well, it depends. If you quantify qualitative data, you basically interpret them. You could say that you add meaning to them. The real question is whether you articulate that. When a physicist looks into the hadron collision results and is giving a number to that, reducing the enormous phenomenon created there, you know, like this, where millions of things happen, reducing that to a confirmation or not of a particular equation, yeah, that is interpreting a lot of rich data, yeah. And you could say that's reducing them, but reducing is inevitable in understanding. So it is a really interesting question to see what we mean when we say that by putting a number to qualitative data, we lose the richness, rather than say we interpret them and open up a discussion about better understanding them, if we do it properly.
So for next session, we will make sure that we have some physicists who can react to that. Judith, maybe the very last comment, and then we have to close, please.
Well, I would definitely say that we lose, meaning when we quantize qualitative data, but not only because we have to make all the people who have assigned, for example, the 7 the same, and by making them the same, we lose riches. But we have to do that because otherwise we cannot count them. And to me, that also means that, different from, for example, many in mixed method research, to me, whether someone uses a scale from 1 to 10 or from very bad to excellent, to me, both are basically quantitative data, because their nature doesn't change. They're both meant to just rank people, and what we can do with them is count them, and also then we could translate the words into numbers, and then also calculate the mean. But also, if we have a scale from very bad to excellent, it does not have anything to do anymore with qualitative data like we have in interviews, because ranking, say, the sentences in an interview in alphabetical order would not make sense. That's actually the fundamental difference between qualitative and quantitative. But we need both, that's clear.
Okay, thank you for this last comment, Judith. So I think it's really time to stop. That was another very rich session. In 2 weeks, we reconvene, and the topic will be the nature of data. Please stay tuned for announcements. You have to register again for each session. So keep an eye on your emails or on your Twitter accounts, because these are the main media where we spread the news. We will post the recording of the video as soon as possible, and again, you will hear when it is on the net. So thank you so much for coming, and see you in 2 weeks.